All righty, good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 o'clock and we will go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Jacqueline Jones Doyle with Tarrant County AgriLife Extension Office. My co-host with me today is Liz Rudd from Dallas County. And our presenters today are Jessica Alderson, Rachel Richter, both of them with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and then Brittany Meyer, who is our horticulture agent from here in Tarrant County as well. For a little housekeeping aspects of things, we do ask that you keep your lines muted today. It just helps with background noise and bandwidth, as well as keeping your videos off during the presentation. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we can relay those to the speakers throughout the presentation. And then at the end of the presentations, we can open it up for actual Q&A. So with that being said, I would like to turn it over to Jessica today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Alderson, and I am an urban biologist stationed in San Antonio. However, I'm familiar with the DFW area because when I started my career with Parks and Wildlife quite some time ago, I started out in 2008 in the office for our urban program. And so that's where Rachel is now. And then we also have Sam Kieschnick there in the DFW area as well. And so I am here in San Antonio, so I deal a lot with urban deer issues in San Antonio, probably more so than what you guys deal with in DFW. When I was leaving the DFW area to come down here in 2012 to work out of this office, we were starting to get some calls about urban deer concerns and overabundant populations in targeted areas throughout the Metroplex. But it was probably approaching that early stages. And so Rachel will talk a little bit more about that at the end of my program. But so let me share my screen and we can start off with the presentation. Let's see. Okay, everybody can see the screen. Hopefully, I can't see anybody. So I'm assuming someone will chime in if nobody can see anything.
So good, Jessica.
Okay, perfect. So today we're going to talk about urban deer management, and we're going to kind of cover the basics of how you decide or how you determine as a community if you have an overabundant deer population. We're also going to cover the different management options and just kind of have some discussions about maybe some of the issues that you guys are starting to see in the Metroplex. And the steps that you can take to be successful at managing deer in an urban setting, because it's very different than managing across a rural landscape. So this is a very common site that you see here in San Antonio. This was taken in one of our neighborhoods not too far from where I live, where we've got lots of deer kind of hanging out in people's front yards. And so with there being 4.6 million white-tailed deer across the state of Texas, it's not uncommon to have communities, especially here in the Hill Country area, that have overabundant deer populations. So why do they do so well in urban environments? Well, one of the main reasons is that they're very highly reproductive. I'm sure that most of you on the call today have seen does with twins and sometimes even triplets, so they can have twins and triplets throughout whenever they're breeding, which then also increases their population pretty quickly. So if the conditions are right and the fawns are surviving every single year, with them having if they're having twins and triplets on a regular basis, that you can see how quickly over years going by, how quickly that population can become overabundant. So being highly reproductive is good for them and not always such a good thing for us in the urban environment. This is a common scene that we get lots of calls about, where we see the does and then the fawns there in the background. And so probably one of the biggest calls of concerns around the springtime is that people are calling saying that they've got these fawns and they've been born in their yards and they're concerned that they're abandoned. And I always want to bring this up whenever we talk about urban deer management, because working with our local wildlife rehabilitators, the majority of the white-tailed deer that get brought to them that are believed to be abandoned really, truly are not. So when the fawns have their babies, they're having them in a natural environment, like our urban setting. They're naturally camouflaged to blend in with the tall grasses and the forbs and the browse out in a rural area, but they're not naturally camouflaged to blend in with our Bermuda grass or St. Augustine grass, right? And so people are seeing them more frequently. Well, the doe's behavior doesn't change in an urban environment. So in the rural area, to protect their young from predators, what they do is they'll put their babies in a safe place, and then they leave them for 6 to maybe 10 hours a day. And they just basically visit them, especially the first few days of their life. They'll just visit them to get them the food that they need so that they can feed on mom. And then they'll leave the area again, because if they're constantly hanging around this one area, that's kind of like a sign that there's being held up to their local predators saying, hey, here's these little helpless babies that can, barely even walk the first couple of days of life. So it's very common for the does to leave those fawns for extended periods of time. So I always discourage urban residents, especially, from intervening, because the best way for our fawns to be able to survive is to allow their moms to raise them the way that it should be. And so unless you see that the fawn is obviously injured, or if you see that they're covered in fire ants or something like that, then by all means, yes, contact a local wildlife rehabilitator. It is illegal for you to take that animal into your home and try to nurse it back to health yourself. You have to be a licensed rehabilitator to do that. And they're located all over the state, and we can give you some resources to be able to find that information, so that if you ever come across a situation where you need to contact a rehabilitator, you have that information handy. So best case scenario is just to leave that fawn be, and also be cautious, because the does can become very protective of their fawns during the springtime when they're being born. And so when we've had in San Antonio alone, 2 dogs that were killed by does protecting their fawns in their yard. So the doe had a baby in the yard. The homeowner didn't realize it. They let their dogs out, and the doe protected that fawn, and they can be very aggressive, especially with those hooves that they have. And so unfortunately, 2 dogs in the last 2 years have passed away due to this type of issue. So definitely, if you live in an environment where there are deer around, be cautious of that when you let your pets out, and make sure that you don't have a doe that's hanging around and maybe potentially having fawns in your yard. The next reason why why we see them in urban environments so much, in addition to being highly reproductive, is habitat loss, of course. So we know that Texas and other states throughout the United States are quickly being developed. Everybody wants to come to Texas, right? It's the best state. And so everybody wants to come to Texas, so they've got to have places to live and schools to go to and places to shop. And so we've got development happening all around us. And, I like I said, I was up in the DFW area, and the last time I went up there, I was surprised at how much had changed in the very short amount of time that I've been gone. So we know that habitat loss definitely has a negative impact on our wildlife species. Lucky for deer, they're an adaptable species. So they can live out at Government Canyon State Natural Area, where we've got 14,000 plus acres of natural environment for them to live in. Or they can live in Fair Oaks Ranch, where there's, homes and people and supplemental feeding and all of this stuff going on, and they can live very comfortably there. So they can adapt to that changing environment. Another issue is the lack of predators. So out in the rural landscape, you would have predators such as mountain lions, coyotes, bobcats. Those are going to be their primary predators. But in an urban environment, we still have those species that live in the urban environment, but those species are not they're not able to overcompete the amount of deer that we have in these urban environments. So it's just, if there's not enough of them to be able to keep these populations in check on a regular basis. And so the most common predator in an urban environment for a deer is going to be most likely a vehicle, right? And so I work with several communities in the San Antonio area where communities are picking up 500-600 dead deer a year on the roads that are being hit by vehicles. And so that's a lot of deer. Another challenge is that, of course, we don't have hunting in our urban environments. So no hunting, so there's no management, right? And so, out in the rural landscape, we have management in the form of hunting, and that helps keep those numbers to a more sustainable level where you can have healthy habitat and healthy wildlife populations. But in an urban environment, hunting is not typically an option in those communities because of different ordinances and for obvious safety reasons, right? We do in San Antonio, unfortunately, have a lot of poaching that occurs, and they occur in these green belts that surround some of these communities that have very high overabundant deer populations in them. So we work with our local game wardens to try to do what we can to educate the communities on some different management options, and then to also make sure that people are aware that if they see something, they need to call our game wardens so that we can catch people that are doing illegal hunting. And then last but not least, we've got lots of supplemental feeding that goes on in our urban environments with deer. People have the biggest hearts, and they think that they're doing good by feeding our wildlife. And when it comes down to it, it really is not a good thing for people to do. So we've had research that shows that the supplemental feeding will draw the deer into these communities. And research has shown that these deer typically don't travel very far distances, that they stay pretty much on the street that they've been fed. And so there's lots of challenges that come along with that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we cover supplemental feeding. So as a segue into supplemental feeding, what do deer naturally eat in the natural environment? So their first choice or their primary choice food is going to be that of forbs. A lot of people have the misconception that they eat lots of grass because they see them with their nose down to the ground eating the grass. But really what they're after is the forb. So it's everything that's growing up in between those grass blades. Their diet typically is made up of less than 10% of grass. And primarily they're looking for those forbs. That's going to be like their most favorite meal. And so anything from like wine cup to sunflower to dayflower to any type of those like wildflower type forb plants is going to be what they're going to be targeting in a more natural environment. And then second choice would be browse, which you think about our seasons and how we are in Texas and how much drought we have. Though they love to eat forbs, a lot of times it's not readily available for them. So their second choice is going to be browse. So that's going to be any of like your shrubby species, such as kidneywood, cedar elm, mulberry, those types of plants. You'll see sometimes in communities that have overabundant deer populations, we call a browse line. And so you basically see where the deer have eaten everything from the ground to where they can, to the, about mid canopy. You'll see sometimes the deer standing on their back legs, reaching their neck up, trying to get the last leaves off of trees or off of some of these browse species that they like to eat. And so you can, as a biologist, I can drive through a community and tell pretty quickly just based on the existing habitat, especially if they have like a green space, a green belt that runs through the community, if there's too many deer in that area because of the pressure it's putting on the natural habitat. So what do deer eat, but maybe should not eat? So being in San Antonio and dealing with urban deer issues, I've seen it all. Everything from, throwing the corn on the ground to people dumping out 40 pounds of corn at the end of their driveway, to hand feeding, to putting troughs out in their yards to feed the deer. And it all really is not good for the deer. You'll see them also trying to even eat at bird feeders So some of our communities that we've worked with that have implemented feeding ordinances prohibiting the public from feeding deer specifically, they'll have a provision in there saying, you need to put your bird feeders up at least 6 feet high so that the deer aren't enticed to try to knock the seed out and eat that. And so supplemental feeding is not good for the deer for a number of reasons. The majority of the time, the food that's being fed, such as corn, has no nutritional value at all to the deer. And so they eat this, they get filled up on this corn, and it has no nutritional value. And so we get lots of calls of communities that say, we feed these deer every single day, and they still look really skinny and they still look really unhealthy. Like, what's going on? Well, not only are you feeding them something that's not healthy for them, provides no nutritional value for them, but you're also artificially increasing the number of deer in these smaller areas, right? So the deer are drawn in and they're hanging out in these 1 or 2 or 3 yards or on the street. They have an increased nose-to-nose contact with each other, which means an increased spread of disease. We've done some extensive testing on some of our urban deer populations in Central Texas, and we found that their parasite loads, so for their intestinal parasites, are just through the roof. And so those can be spread because they're being close to close. They're eating and pooping in the same areas as other deer that are infected. And so we see disease spread a lot quicker in these areas where we have overabundant deer populations. So supplemental feeding kind of creates this issue of spreading diseases a lot quicker. And that goes for all wildlife species. I work with a lot of communities that have implemented ordinances that prevent feeding of all wildlife, and they'll put a provision in there allowing properly maintained bird feeders, because the same goes true for like feeding ducks at a pond and feeding other wild animals. And so a lot of individuals will ask me, well, Jessica, I know I'm not supposed to feed corn. It's not good for them. I understand that. But my landowner friend in South Texas, they feed protein feed. So can I feed protein feed, or can I put out scraps of my vegetable garden or my fruit garden that I have, because I don't want it to go to waste? And my answer is still always no. You don't want to put food at all out for them. If anything, you would want to plant native plants that they would be attracted to, those forbs and browse species. That way they can eat their natural food, and it's not going to be in such abundance that it's going to cause that artificial concentration of those deer in those smaller areas. So it's not a very popular recommendation. A lot of people get frustrated with that recommendation, but from a biological perspective, it's the best thing and the safest thing for the deer, honestly. And then, of course, supplemental feeding also begins to allow those deer to become habituated to people. And even though they're very beautiful animals, they should be appreciated at a distance, because they can become dangerous, especially during times of rut, or if these does are protecting their fawns. All it takes is one swoop of that antler and it can potentially cause some serious damage. So you always have to keep that in mind. These are wild animals that we're talking about. So some of the challenges that we see with these deer populations that are becoming overabundant in our urban communities, you can see the deer in the top photo there that is very skinny. This is a very common sight that we see in our overabundant deer populations in the San Antonio area. Their ribs are showing. They just don't look very healthy at all. Their coat is kind of roughed up instead of nice and slick and smooth. You'll notice in that photo, she also has some abscesses along her jawline. Many times that happens because they're eating corn and they get compacted in their mouth because they're not designed to eat that type of hard food source. And so they'll end up getting little cuts in their mouth, and then it turns into an abscess, and then it turns into this big, huge festering infection. Also, you'll see it in the front of their mouth as well, because they're eating on hard surfaces. For some reason, urban constituents feel the need to put it out on, instead of just putting the corn in their grass, they put it out on a hard surface, such as at the end of a cul-de-sac or on their driveway or something like that. I guess they think that gives them better access, but what that does is it really tears up that soft tissue on their mouth and they get infected. Of course, deer vehicle collisions are a big concern. If you poll the majority of people that drive through the hill country, most of them have probably had some type of encounter with a vehicle with deer. So that definitely is a big concern, could be dangerous for people as well as the deer, right? And despite all the deer crossing signs you can put up, they're not going to cross at those areas, right? You just never know where they're going to be crossing. Supplemental feeding, we already kind of covered that. But definitely this is a potentially dangerous situation here where he's feeding this nice big buck. And again, all it would take for him to get a little bit frustrated and, one swoop of his antler and he could do some serious damage to this individual. Landscape damage is probably another common thing that we get lots of calls about, people calling and complaining that they spent the whole weekend planting these beautiful flower gardens in their yard and they woke up the next morning and they was all gone because the deer ate everything that they could get their little mouths on. And so that definitely is a big conflict issue in our urban communities. Now, I think we're going to talk about it later on in the program today about deer-resistant plants. And there are deer-resistant plants out there, but I will caution you, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this, that those deer don't always read those lists. So in extreme times, like when we're in a drought year, we see that the deer will still eat those, like they're opportunistic feeders, right? They're gonna do what they need to do to survive. So they will still eat those technically labeled deer resistant plants. So don't think that just because you plant those that they're not going to be touched, because there's a possibility that they definitely could be. So keep that in mind. And then again, in areas where there's more natural environment, like through a green belt or something that goes through a community, you'll see that natural browse line where the deer have basically eaten all the vegetation from the bottom of the ground up to as far as they can reach. And that's a pretty good indicator that you've got too many deer. This picture up here on the top left is someone collecting water samples for water quality. And people don't realize how wildlife can negatively impact our water quality. So I'm working with the city of New Braunfels on their watershed protection plan. And they did some bacteria source collecting, and it was found that 60% of the E. coli in the Comal River and the dry Comal Creek were attributed to wildlife. And wildlife being waterfowl, white-tailed deer, and feral hogs. And so that's concerning, right? So if you've got these areas of overabundant deer populations and they're defecating everywhere and it eventually gets into our water systems, that's definitely a management option that you have to be able to improve your water quality as a community. So it's something to think about and to monitor as you're implementing your management plans. The next photo right next to that on the top right, we term this as hardware disease. It's not a disease at all, but it's basically where especially bucks will get random things tangled in their antler. So this individual has a volleyball net entangled in his antlers. We've seen everything from soccer goals to buckets to Christmas lights. Anything that they can get themselves tangled in, they definitely will. This typically happens during the time of rut and when they're going from velvet to hard antler. They've got a lot of scent glands located on their face and their neck, and so they're constantly rubbing their face and their bodies on things. And so that's how they will tend to get things hung up in their antlers. And then also just simply, especially during the time of rut, the bucks have one thing on their mind and they're just running through yards chasing the females and they're not paying attention, and then they get caught up in a soccer goal or a net. We've had a couple of individual bucks that have smacked into the side of vehicles that were parked in the street because they were just so focused on one thing, right? And so these are definitely some challenges that we get called about pretty frequently. Usually, as long as the deer is mobile and they can eat and they can drink, we typically don't do anything with these animals because their antlers shed every year. So once they shed their antlers, all of this stuff that's entangled in their antlers should drop off with those antlers and it should be okay. Of course, if they're not able to eat or drink, then we definitely need to know about that. But I will say that deer are very susceptible to stress. And so even if we are successful at trapping these individuals with the hardware disease, a lot of times the outcome still isn't good for the deer because they succumb to that overstimulation and the stress from being trapped and having the stuff taken off of their heads. A lot of times it's just too much for them to be able to handle. So you have to keep that in mind. So best case scenario, we just kind of let them do their thing. Hopefully they can eat and drink and walk around just fine. And it eventually will shed off when they shed their antlers. We even saw a few years ago, we got a call of an individual that had been rubbing on the really thick wire that people use to protect vegetation. And he had gotten that wire all tangled up in his antler, so much so that he actually uprooted this fruit tree and was dragging it down the street. So you've got to be even cautious with that, with those types of scenarios as well. And then also another concern is disease for the deer themselves, and then potential disease risks for people. So for disease for the deer themselves, there are a vast variety of diseases that they can get, and definitely in an overabundant population where there's a lot of deer hanging out in a very small area. They pass those diseases back and forth and can spread them very quickly. Our biggest primary concern right now in the state of Texas is chronic wasting disease. As of right now, we don't have any positives in Bexar County, and I don't believe you guys have had any positives in Dallas or Tarrant counties. But we do have positives of free range roaming CWD positive white-tailed deer in Medina County and counties in the Panhandle and out in West Texas. So we've got to, and in some more in even South Texas. And so it's definitely a disease that we are very concerned about. With chronic wasting disease, it's one that once they get it, it is a fatal disease. The deer typically succumb to that disease within 3 to 5 years of getting it. It's highly contagious. The prions can live in the soil. So even if you have a positive deer that passes through an area and then a negative deer passes through that area, they could potentially pick it up in the soil. So it's a disease that we as Parks and Wildlife we're monitoring, and we have mandatory check stations. If you are a hunter, I encourage you to get your deer tested for CWD, no matter where you harvest them across the state, just so you can contribute to us monitoring all of the deer in Texas, so that we can pick up those positives as they come in as quick as we possibly can. So with supplemental feeding, that again is going to be something, if heaven forbid we do end up finding a positive in a free range roaming deer up in Bexar County, the amount of supplemental feeding that we have going on in our communities here is really scary, because it would definitely aid in pushing that disease across our county, just because of how many deer we have and how many people supplemental feed, despite recommendations from the state. Another concern is a disease for the public. So Lyme disease, which is not actually caused by the deer themselves. However, the deer tick, which primary host is the deer, is what causes Lyme disease. Now, we don't have the number of positive Lyme disease cases in people in Texas, high numbers like they do in other states up north and on the east side of the United States, where it's more prevalent, but it definitely is a concern. So you would assume that when you have higher deer populations.
Y'all were putting up the thingy, so.
Oh, I'm not sure, somebody has their thing unmuted. And so you assume that you have higher deer populations, there's higher chance of having deer ticks, which then brings a higher chance for Lyme disease for people to be able to contract. So there's definitely a concern there as well. So the public perception of urban deer. So I did my master's thesis at A&M in College Station, and my master's work was focusing on the human dimensions of urban deer management. And we found that public perception of urban deer is very closely tied to their background education, their knowledge of just basic deer biology and ecology, and most importantly, their experience with deer. So I was looking at their acceptance of urban deer management and where they fell on that scale of accepting different management options, and how educated they were about the issue, and what their experiences were. And so, of course, you could assume that someone who's had a negative experience, such as this sick doe in their front yard, or their dog being killed by a doe protecting a fawn, or someone who's been involved in a deer vehicle collision, is going to be more likely to accept some type of management practice in the community for deer than someone who maybe is friends with a rehabilitator that's gotten to bottle feed fawns, or simply saw a mom and a fawn passing through their yard and didn't have any type of negative experience with the deer. Their plants didn't get eaten by the deer. And so those individuals that have more positive experiences, and maybe less education about deer biology and ecology and how things kind of work and how supplemental feeding isn't good, and just basic deer biology and ecology, that they're more likely to be against the different management practices. So how do you manage urban deer in an urban setting when you've got more to think about than just the deer? Like, we as biologists, myself and Rachel, we know what to do to manage deer populations. We know how to solve that problem. But then you throw people in the mix, and it makes things a lot more complicated. And so there's a lot of steps that you have to go through to get public buy-in, to educate the community on, why we're making the recommendations that we're making. And I want to just say one thing. So the role of Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists, myself and Rachel, when someone calls us and says, hey, I think we might have a lot of deer hanging out in our neighborhood, and we maybe want to talk to you about this. Our role is to simply provide technical guidance and education. So we educate the community on some of the challenges. We can go out and we can look at the property and kind of help you determine if you have an issue, or, if it's early stages, or if there's way too many deer. We can even make recommendations for deer surveys, for browse surveys, all kinds of things. But simply what we do is we are simply providing technical guidance, and we can say, we make these recommendations, but ultimately it's up to the community or the homeowners association, the city, whoever's making the contact. It's up to them on how they want to proceed with the actual management part of managing the deer if they feel like they've got a problem. So Parks and Wildlife does not come into a community and say, you have to remove X number of deer or else. Like, that's not how that works. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there about our role in managing urban deer populations. And so we simply provide technical guidance, and we can assist with public meetings, with media, with writing up social media, doing posts for that, or newsletters and education. But at the end of the day, it's up to the people of the community to decide how they want to move forward. And what works for one community may not work for another community. And a lot of it comes down to budget too, because it's not cheap to manage urban deer populations. And so a lot of times that's what the kind of the deal breaker is for a lot of communities that I work with in the San Antonio area. So what are some of the steps for success? First, you have to define the problem. Do you have a problem? A lot of individuals will call me and say, well, I need to know how many deer we have in my community, so then we can decide how many deer we should have. Well, unfortunately, we don't know how many deer there should be in an urban environment, right? So in a rural setting, what we do is we do spotlight surveys in a rural setting, and we have an idea. So for example, in the hill country, we typically recommend about 1 deer per 12 to 18 acres. That's 1 deer per 12 to 18 acres. And most of the communities that I'm dealing with in San Antonio that we have done deer surveys in are dealing with 1 deer per 5 acres if they're lucky, sometimes less than that, sometimes 1 deer per acre. And so that's a lot of deer, right? And so The challenge becomes that people get focused on how many deer should we have and how many deer do we have. And that shouldn't be the focus. What the focus should be is focusing on what we call the social or cultural carrying capacity, which would be looking at how many deer are you guys picking up every year dead on the side of the road from deer vehicle collisions? How many people are complaining about the landscape damage that they're dealing with? Have there been any negative encounters with the deer in the community, whether it be with people or with pets? Are there fawns being born in people's front yards? So I encourage my urban constituents, instead of doing deer surveys in an urban environment where we don't really have a set way to estimate those populations. So what we do is we basically modify the rural spotlight survey for deer, and we modify that to fit into our urban environment to kind of get an estimate. And again, it's simply an estimate. It could be a really high estimate or it could be a really low estimate. And so instead of focusing on time and effort on doing those surveys throughout the community to see how many deer they have, I encourage them to really focus on those cultural or social carrying capacity things such as the deer vehicle collisions, the encounters with people and pets, and landscape damage and deer calls, those types of things. So how do you define the problem really is up to the community. Like, how do they want to look at those issues? Are they getting lots of calls and complaints? Are they picking up 600 dead deer a year on the side of the road? I can tell that community, if they tell me they pick up 600 dead deer a year, I can tell them right then and there, you've got too many deer, right? So you don't have to spend the time and your resources to do full-on surveys to know that you have an issue. So Parks and Wildlife, we can work with you on trying to define the problem and decide if you do have a problem or where you're at in that process. So again, eating the landscaping, deer vehicle collisions, interactions with people and deer and pets and deer. Are you seeing a lot of diseased deer that are sick, like the one that we saw in the previous slides? And then also water quality. If you're monitoring for water quality, if you have high E. coli levels in there, it may be worth doing some bacteria source tracking to determine where that stuff is coming from, right? This picture is a photo that was taken out of Lakeway, which was one of my study sites for my master's degree. And the city of Lakeway had prevented people from feeding deer. They put in a city ordinance, and this individual was getting really creative, and she was trying to feed the deer in her garage because if they couldn't catch her feeding them, they couldn't sight her. But we knew what was going on. Obviously, this deer is not there for the local carpool, right? So even with extensive education, community members have to understand that people are still going to, so if we're talking about supplemental feeding, you're still going to have individuals that are going to supplemental feed, but the majority of those individuals will not, because they'll have a better understanding of why we're making that recommendation. So the idea is to get everybody to stop feeding, which that would be great, but that's never going to happen. But if you can get the majority of the people in the community to understand why we're making these recommendations, then it definitely is considered a win. Next up, you want to identify your goals. A lot of communities are under the impression that the goal of an urban deer management program is to remove all the deer from the community. And that's not feasible. And that's not what we want either. I hear a lot of times that community members say, well, we moved into this neighborhood because we love the deer and we see the deer and we love all the green belts that are around us and we love all the wildlife. And that's wonderful. People are getting more in touch with wanting to have green space and getting away from, non-native plants and things like that. And so we're wanting to be more natural, and that's wonderful. And you can still enjoy the deer. So communities that have been dealing with urban deer issues since the 90s, like Hollywood Park and Lakeway, those communities have been removing deer from those areas since the 90s, and you still can drive through those communities and see deer. The difference is you don't see 40 deer in the front of people's yards, and the deer are a lot healthier. You can look at the deer, they're not skinny, their hair isn't just kind of wiry and nasty looking, they don't have the abscesses, and they look a lot healthier because those populations are being managed. So there's a fine balance there. So again, identifying your goals. Some of your goals would be to reduce the population, not eliminate it, right? Reduce deer vehicle collisions. So again, going back to those cultural carrying capacities or social carrying capacity, however you want to term it, you want to keep track of those things. So like Hollywood Park and Lakeway, they keep track of how many deer vehicle collisions they have, how many dead deer are they picking up, any calls about sick deer, injured deer, any of those animals that are getting things tangled up in their antlers, right? And then of course, water quality. If you're looking at that as one of your measures, definitely that's going to be something that you'll see over time improve as you're managing the deer population. And then next, once we've got the problem defined and we've got some goals laid out, the biggest, most important step in this whole process is building consensus and finding a solution. So like I mentioned to you before, myself and Rachel, we can come in and tell you exactly how to manage the deer population. That's easy. We can tell you how to do it. We know how to do it. But you add people to the mix and it becomes a little bit more challenging because everybody has their own opinions, right? Everybody has their own emotions, which is great, but you really have to spend that time educating the public, building that consensus, because if you don't, it can backfire really, really quickly. So you need to get your local homeowners involved, have some meetings, have myself or Rachel or another Parks and Wildlife biologist come out to your community and talk about urban deer challenges and what we see and why we're not recommending to supplemental feed and why we recommend ordinances and what management options are there. A lot of people don't even know that there are management options available for urban communities. Get your local government officials involved, put together wildlife action committees. So not just specific to deer, it could be for all wildlife in your community and how you're going to come up with action plans for how to deal with some of these issues. And so building consensus is what makes or breaks a management strategy. I've worked with many, many communities since I've been with Parks and Wildlife. And if they spend time working with Parks and Wildlife and doing the education and consensus building, it usually goes a lot smoother than someone who just decides, okay, we're going to hire a trapper and we're going to start trapping deer out of this community. That usually doesn't go over very well because then people don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. So it definitely is not, this is not a problem that happens overnight, and it's not a problem that can be solved overnight. It's a long process, and it's worth it to take your time to work through this part of the management process, because if you don't, it could be really detrimental and end up costing the city or the homeowners association a lot more money than if they took their time and did it the right way. And then you want to, of course, once you've decided about what solution is best for you and your community, then you want to implement that, right? So you want to make sure that you're going to implement whatever it is. So if you're going to implement a feeding ordinance, which a lot of times that's a first step in that process, along with public education, that you implement a feeding ordinance and you actually go follow through with it. So if you have people that are feeding and you have a feeding ordinance, you have to ticket them. They have to know that this is a serious thing, which depending on how big the community is, can be challenging, right? To be able to enforce that. We've got enough to have to enforce as far as our law enforcement officers and things like that. But I will tell you that as a result of that watershed protection plan that I was working with the city of New Braunfels, they implemented a citywide wildlife feeding ordinance, and it's been very effective. Of course, they have a little bit of a unique challenge because they're such a touristy community, but they have their rangers out there in their parks where a lot of the feeding happens, and they're constantly educating the public and letting them know why we're not feeding. There's the wonderful kiosks throughout their parks, discouraging the feeding of wildlife, letting people know about the ordinance. So it definitely can be done. And other communities too have some really great ordinances, and you can do an ordinance specific to deer or specific to ducks, or you can do all wildlife. So if anybody on the call today is interested in some example ordinances, I would be happy to share that information with you. So let's talk about the actual management options themselves. So what options do we have? Let's cover the non-lethal options first. So again, I mentioned feeding ordinances, and you're probably like, oh, I'm so tired of hearing her talk about supplemental feeding. We get it, right? But it's very, very important because we do have research that shows that it draws these deer in higher concentrations, and there is increased spread of disease and parasites. And so stopping the feeding is not going to solve your overabundant deer population. However, it will get the deer to disperse more naturally across the existing landscape. So you won't see 40 to 50 deer hanging out in people's yards. I can tell you that when I drive into a community, when I'm just starting to kind of see what their issues are, I can usually point out the houses that feed because that's where the deer hang out, right? So you want to put in a feeding ordinance, which can be challenging sometimes if this is a homeowners association, not necessarily a city that's dealing with the problem, but just a homeowners association. Sometimes there's challenges there, but you can still educate and discourage people from feeding deer. And that's been pretty successful here in some of our communities in San Antonio. Putting up fencing, of course, that's always an option. You can put up the fencing. I will tell you that deer can clear a 6-foot fence, so it'd have to be, over 6 feet. And fencing is expensive, right? So some communities have said, well, what if we just fenced in our whole entire community and, tried to push the deer out? Well, you could definitely try that for sure. I will tell you that I work with USAA here. They have a big, huge campus for USAA, the banking and insurance company. And the deer wait at the gates to go in and out of USAA because people there feed them on their lunch breaks. So they'll hang out and then they wait for people to go through the gate and then they just walk through the gate. So they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for. So fencing is definitely an option. And like I mentioned about like putting up fencing around some of your newly planted trees and things like that, just be cautious of that so that it doesn't end up in their antlers later on down the road, right? So make sure you're aware of where you're placing those and what deer are in your area. Deterrent. So there's lots of deterrents out there on the market. I would say most of them are pretty ineffective, but you definitely are welcome to try some of the different deterrents. If they are effective, they're probably going to be pretty temporary. So a lot of times you have to pair some of these management options with other options. I know some people have had success. So like if you have a garden that a deer is frequently getting into or other wildlife, they have this device, it's called a scarecrow, and you basically hook this device up to a water hose, and it's a sensor activated. And so you put it in the direction of where the area is that you want to deter the animals from. And when they go by that area, it shoots out a burst of water. So that's been pretty effective. Most wildlife don't like random bursts of water, but the deer will get smart and other wildlife will get smart about it. And so they'll start going behind the motion sensor or around it. And so you've got to be able to move that around pretty frequently so they have no clue what to expect to get them to deter from that area. So you got to be smarter than the deer. Another non-lethal option is a trap, transport, and transplant permit. And that's called the Triple T permit. And that's a permit that you have to apply for as a homeowners association or a city. And you apply for that through Texas Parks and Wildlife. So basically what this is that you partner up and with a private contractor that has agreed to come out and remove X number of deer. And basically they trap them and they transport them and then they relocate them to an approved piece of property. So approved being the key word there. So it has to be approved by a Parks and Wildlife biologist. It does not have to be high fenced. However, it does have to be a property that can sustain the number of deer that are being relocated there. So if the landowner already has too many deer on their property, which in Texas isn't hard to do with 4.6 million white-tailed deer in the state of Texas, they may not be eligible to be a transplant property for Triple T. So you have to keep that in mind. Also, with chronic wasting disease, many landowners are very fearful of bringing deer onto their property with the idea that they could potentially be bringing or introducing CWD or some other type of disease to their existing deer on their property. So as of today, our Triple T permit has been suspended for now due to the increase of CWD positives across the state. So as of right now, none of my urban constituents that are dealing with urban deer management, they are not doing Triple T because that program has been suspended. They are anticipating bringing that program back with some stricter regulations, but I don't know when that's going to happen. So even though that program is suspended right now, before that, all the constituents I worked with that tried to do Triple T, it almost never worked out because they were not able to find a landowner that had the amount of property that was needed to relocate those deer or were willing to take deer. And it has to be in Texas. So that option is typically taken off the table pretty quickly when you start really looking into it. Now, there have been cases where there has been anthrax that have wiped out deer populations in certain areas of the state. And we have been able to do Triple T from urban communities to replenish the deer populations where anthrax unfortunately killed out the majority of their deer. But that doesn't happen very often. I'd say so I've been with Parks and Wildlife since 2008, and there's only been 2 seasons where that was the case. So typically Triple T, even though it's not an active permit as of right now, even before then, it was very difficult to find landowners that could sustain the deer that were being relocated. Fertility control, last but not least, is on the non-lethal option. So we get lots of questions about this as well. There are various types of fertility control, being hormonal injection to surgical sterilization, to like implanting things in the does to keep them from being kind of like a Mirena type of fertility control for people, but for deer. And so all of these are different options. They can be very expensive, definitely expensive. But I will say with fertility control, it does not address the already existing overabundant deer population right then, right? So basically fertility control, you implement it, it can be effective managing your deer population from that day moving forward, but it's not going to address the immediate need to deal with that population that's already out of control. So a lot of times communities that use fertility control, they do a Triple T or a TTP permit to bring that population level down, and then they apply fertility control to kind of sustain it in the future. Now, I will say that as far as Texas goes, there is no approved method of fertility control that can be used with deer in the state of Texas to date. If you're a community that is interested in fertility control, in order to do that in the state of Texas, you would have to partner up with a university and get a research permit to be able to move forward with some type of fertility control in the state of Texas. So as of right now, we don't have any communities in Texas that are currently utilizing fertility control as an option. And I'll send out a document after this webinar for the AgriLife Extension agents to send out to all of you that kind of goes over the pros and cons of all the different management options, because there are pros and cons to all of them, and then fertility control included. And so it's definitely something that's not going to right away impact your overabundant deer populations. That's something to keep in mind. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the lethal methods. So I mentioned the TTP permit, which is a trap, transport, and process permit. And that permit is also through Parks and Wildlife. And again, the community that applies for this permit, the HOA or the municipality that applies for it, they are basically using a private contractor that's licensed to trap native white-tailed deer, and they transport them to a processor, and they're processed, and then the meat is then donated to the local food banks or to the charity of their choice. So the majority, well, all of my constituents right now, since the Triple T permit has been suspended for right now, all of my constituents that I'm working with that are actively managing deer are currently using the TTP permit. And again, you apply for the permit through Parks and Wildlife. You work with myself or Rachel to go through that permit process. But again, you're contracting with an individual who comes out and traps those deer and takes them to the processor, and then they get processed and donated to the local food banks or again to your charity of choice. Now, with both the Triple T and the TT permit, you have to do testing for chronic wasting disease. So the most current testing requirements are 15 samples per permit. So if you do a TTP permit, the first 15 deer that they process, they're going to test for CWD, submit that for CWD. Same if you do a Triple T permit, they're going to test the first 15 deer for CWD. Testing for CWD is a post-mortem test. So if you are doing a Triple T, 15 deer will have to be euthanized in order to do that testing. So if I've had individuals in the past that have applied for both permits, so let's say they only got approved to move 30 deer to an individual's property, and then they're going to do TTP for the rest. If you're applying for both permits, you only have to do the 15 tests. So it doesn't have to be 15 for each permit. You just have to meet the minimum requirement of that 15, and then you're good to go for both permits. So, right now, all the communities, pretty much their option is TTP, in addition to educational programs, feeding ordinances, those types of things. So that's what they're using right now. Individual hunting and permitted sharpshooters. A lot of my cities cringe when I talk about this, but I will tell you that other states utilize these options as successful urban deer management practices. And so if it's done correctly, so obviously you're not just going to have, open season in the middle of Fair Oaks Ranch or in the middle of Mansfield or something like that, right? So obviously this is very highly organized. There's proficiency for shooting. It can be done through archery or through gun. And so it just depends on what the community is okay with. I will tell you that as of today, no community in Texas is using individual hunting or sharpshooting in a true urban environment to manage urban deer. However, there are communities that have shown interest in doing that. And a lot of times they have like larger acreage parks where they could potentially close down those areas. So for example, there was a golf course that was having a large number of deer that were kind of hanging out on the golf course, and they were going to close it down, and they wanted to do an organized archery hunt. And so I was working with them to get that going, and the city shut them down due to their current regulations for discharging a firearm, which includes bow and arrows. So unfortunately, the city was not willing to take the risk associated with having those types of events at a city level. And so that option was quickly taken off the table. So as you can see, there's lots of options for managing urban deer, but many times once you really start looking into some of these options, they're really not available for us depending on, where you live in the state. So my final thing is a question that I get is when I'm talking to communities is when are you done? When can you stop managing the deer? Can we just apply for a TTP permit, do it 1 year, and then stop? And the answer is no. So once you start managing deer, the recommendation is, of course, you can do whatever you want, right? As a municipality or an HOA, we're just simply providing the technical guidance. So our recommendations from a biological perspective would be if you start managing the deer, it needs to be a constant every year. So like I mentioned, Lakeway and Hollywood Park are the two longest urban deer communities that have been dealing with these issues since the 90s. They have consistently trapped and removed, whether it was through Triple T or TTP, every single year since the 90s. So they have it built in their budget to be able to do that. And so if you were to stop within 2 to 3 years, you'll be right back up to your overabundant population, right? Because they are so highly reproductive and they can adapt to our changing environment. So you don't want to lose all this momentum that you get going and building consensus and doing the public education, and then lose it all because you decide that you don't want to trap 1 year or 2 years in a row. So we really highly encourage our communities to continue that active management. And so Lakeway and Hollywood Park, when they first started out, they were trapping anywhere from 200 to 300 deer a year for the first year or two. Now they're trapping probably less than 75 deer a year. And when you drive through their community, you're not seeing the browse lines like you used to back in the 90s and the early 2000s. You're seeing healthier deer populations. Your fawn survival is higher. And so it's a really good thing for the habitat as well as the deer. And then for the people in the community, they can still enjoy seeing the deer, but they don't have 40 of them hanging out in their front yard begging for handouts, right? And so you're never done, unfortunately. So, and Parks and Wildlife will be with you every step of the way if you allow us to help out with public education and building consensus. We've got some really great technology that we can incorporate called Turning Point Technology, which is basically an anonymous polling system where we can gauge community acceptance of the different deer management options. And I've done it to where we do these polls before the educational program. And a lot of people are like, no way, you're not doing anything with my deer. And then we do the educational program and let them know like what we're seeing in the community and kind of educating the public similar to what we just did today. And then we'll re-poll them. And then people are like, oh yeah, we have a deer problem and we need to do something about it. So we know that public education works. So if you invest the time in that and you allow Parks and Wildlife to help out with that, you're more likely to be successful in your management program for sure. So with that, I will mention too that, again, I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that a lot of times the biggest challenge with urban deer management in our communities is budget. The document that I'm going to send out to the AgriLife Extension agents to send out to you guys is, or maybe Rachel may be able to put it in the chat if she has it available. It's available PDF online as well. And so I don't know, Rachel, if you can find it. If not, I can after I'm done wrapping up here. And so we can put that in the chat and then we can also send it out via email as well. So you'll have it, but it's got kind of a list of price ranges on there. And so for example, the Triple T and the TTP permit, the permit is free to apply for. Our services as Parks and Wildlife is free. So the technical guidance side is free. But the person you have to contract through to remove the deer, they have the fees, right? And so the going rate used to be about $200 to $250 per deer. And I know now because of all the high conflict that surrounds urban deer management, which we kind of touched a little bit on, a lot of people get very emotionally charged when you start telling them that they shouldn't be feeding the deer. Many individuals will have names for the deer that they've known for years on end in their community. We've had people put collars on deer, which is illegal, by the way. So it's a very emotionally charged issue. And so when those emotions start running high, people do some things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, like cutting down drop nets or using noise deterrents to deter the deer from getting into traps and things like that. And so that ended up costing the cities more money and the trappers more time and money. And so they started doing more of a flat rate charging system. So I'm not sure how that compares to what they used to charge, which was about the $200 to $250 per deer. So now the way that they charge communities is a little bit different because of all that conflict. And if you just, you Google City of Lakeway deer conflict, I'm sure you'll come up with all kinds of interesting negative press and all of that. And if you ever have questions about that, please let me know. I will make sure that you have the right, accurate information. And to assure you that the individuals that people are hiring They know what they're doing. They're doing it, by the books. They're following all the regulations. One of the biggest misconceptions out there is that, the trappers, they cut their antlers off and there's bleeding everywhere. And that's not true, because the time that they're allowed to trap for those permits, they're already in hard antler. And so it has no blood supply to those antlers during that time at all. And they're required by regulation to cut their antlers off, to saw their antlers off before putting them in trailers for transport for the safety of the deer. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. And so my contact information is here on the screen. That's my direct cell phone number, as well as my email address. And of course, I'll be here till the end of the workshop and happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thank you all so much. I wish we could have done this in person. It's a lot more fun to see faces instead of black screens with names. I don't know, maybe everybody's asleep.
Hey, Jessica, we do have a question in the chat box. It states,
Okay.
I heard that deer are testing positive for COVID. Is this true? And are you testing them for it?
Great question. So we've gotten a lot of calls about that, just with people concerned about COVID and deer. This all kind of came up when USDA was doing some just monitoring of deer populations, and they happened to stumble across the fact that they were testing positive for COVID. So these deer were not symptomatic. It just shows basically that they were exposed to the COVID virus at some point. There's not been documentation of people contracting COVID from deer. And at this point, after consulting we now have 2 state veterinarians that work with Parks and Wildlife. It's not a big concern for Texas. And so we are not actively testing deer for COVID in our state right now. Were there any other questions?
Here's another one. My spouse insists on feeding deer. Is there a nutritional feed for rural deer?
So for rural deer, if you live out in the rural area and you want to feed deer, protein feed is good. But again, I would say that I would only feed deer, even in the rural area, if you're actively managing deer. So if you're going out and you're hunting every season, or you bring your friends out and your family out and you guys hunt, and you can keep that population in check with the hunting management option, then I would say, sure, I definitely wouldn't do corn. High protein feed would be good to do. That would be fine. But if you're not hunting on your property, then my answer would still be the same as in an urban environment. No, I would discourage feeding. And if you really feel the desire to provide a food source, then shift your focus on the native forbs and browse that they would naturally eat out in the rural environment. And if you need ideas on those types of plants, feel free to shoot me an email and I can provide you a list of that.
A dolphin tested positive for the avian flu. Are deer tested? Can they have it?
Interesting. I had not heard that. As of right now in Texas, for deer, the only thing that we are currently testing for is chronic wasting disease. And like I mentioned earlier, that the way there are like tests that you can do for CWD on live animals, it's very expensive. And it causes stress to the deer. So it's not something that we do as Parks and Wildlife, but some of the deer breeders throughout our state meet their testing requirements by doing live testing. So for Parks and Wildlife, we only do post-mortality testing. And so we do that at so we've got interns stationed throughout the state, and then our biologists as well. So we'll pick up roadkill and test for CWD. We test at the different meat processing plants. So I go usually a couple weekends a year during hunting season and interact with the hunters and ask if we can test for CWD on the deer that they've harvested. And then we've got the mandatory check stations for our mandatory surveillance areas where there have been positives in deer in specific counties. And if you need more information on that, I'm happy to share that with you guys. But as of right now, the only thing that we're testing whitetail deer for are CWD. Now, on occasion, we had a community here in San Antonio that had about 22 deer that died within a very short period of time. And we went in with our state veterinarian and we did some necropsies on the deer to determine what they were dying from. And it showed that they were severely malnourished despite being heavily fed with some supplemental feeding, and that they were young deer that had succumbed to EHD, and they were also very, very overloaded with intestinal parasites. So in a case-by-case basis where we have a large number of deer dying off in a short period of time, we'll get our state veterinarians involved in that situation and do some extensive testing. But just on a normal day-to-day operations with Parks and Wildlife, right now, the only thing that we're testing for is CWD.
My wife feeds alfalfa 3/4 of a bale a day. All browse is gone. How does one quit feeding when there is nothing left except those feeding corn? We're talking about years of feeding, so all development is gone, probably 200 deer in 2 square mile area.
Okay. And I'm guessing the vegetation is gone because of development, or is it gone because we're in a drought year?
Doesn't state at this time.
Yeah. I mean, you can feel free to give me a call and we can discuss that a little bit further. Depending on where your property is, I may have some better guidance on that. But yeah, feel free to give me a call later on this afternoon or whenever you have time to chat. Like I said, my direct cell phone number is on. Oh, looks like you maybe said development. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. And so deer will travel long distances to get the resources that they need. Depending on where you're located, I would have to look at like a satellite image to see if there's areas where they could, go, like Weatherford. Yeah, maybe Rachel can chime in on that one. I mean, development is always a big concern, but we have here in San Antonio, we've got living in the medical center area where it seems like they're like trapped in this area, but they find the resources that they need to be able to survive. And so we did a study out at Camp Bullis, which is one of our military installations here in San Antonio. And I mean, those deer were crossing over the highway, and Camp Bullis is all natural. Like they have golden cheek warbler habitat there, black-cap vireo habitat. It's all a very natural military base. And the deer were traveling all over the place because they don't feed out there. And so you'd be surprised at how far they'll travel for the food sources that they need. Obviously, if you've been feeding for an extended period of time, I maybe wouldn't just completely 100% stop, but you can start to kind of bring that back a little bit and see what happens. But the deer will eventually disperse and go find the resources that they need for sure.
Okay. It seems that the Triple T program would be stressful for deer, similar to removing foreign items from antlers.
Yeah, so that's always a concern too about the success rate of relocation. A lot of individuals like the Triple T option in an urban environment because they think, oh, well, we're going to trap the deer from this community and we're going to take it and we're going to relocate it in a ranch in South Texas and they're going to frolic in the meadows for years to come. The reality of it is that these landowners are wanting the deer so that they can harvest them, right? And so most of the time they're harvested within a year or 2 or 5 of when they're relocated. There is concern so there are regulations that are put in place depending on where the animal is being trapped and where it's being transported to, because extended periods of travel and being contained can cause what we call capture myopathy, and they can succumb to that. And the stress is just so overwhelming that they end up dying. So unfortunately, I would say that there's probably less chance in a shorter distance of relocation of there being mortality than one that's like being taken up to the panhandle or something like that, where they have to stop and they have to be unloaded off the trailer into a holding pen and then loaded back onto the trailer and all of that. So they're definitely, like I mentioned, there's pros and cons to every single one of these options. And I'll make sure that I get that document out to you guys so you can kind of see that. Another thing I wanted to mention too about rehabilitation. So the regulations for rehabilitators has also changed for deer movement for rehabilitators. So even our game wardens are not supposed to go out and like relocate fawns or pick up fawns for release. And so there's regulations that have changed even at the rehabilitation level with regard to chronic wasting disease. That's how concerned our state is about that disease and about it spreading across the state. So just make sure that you're aware of that as well.
Okay. We have a gentleman that has his hand raised. Gary Lacey, did you have a question?
I am trying to send a chat and I'm technically challenged. I can't figure out how to send the chat.
No, that's okay.
Not a problem. What's your question?
I'm trying to send a chat.
Oh, well, you can just ask your question.
Oh, you can just ask your question. You're fine.
Yeah.
So how do I do that?
Just ask it right now. Like just ask me your question. You don't have
Well, I did ask it and I'm trying to send it to you, but it's not showing up.
That's okay. You can just verbally ask me right now. That's
well, okay.
yeah.
I'm just wondering, if you consume venison with CWD, can you get the disease yourself?
Can you get CWD as a person?
Yes, if you venison.
Oh, if you eat venison. According to CDC, if you're if you harvest a deer and you don't eat the lymph nodes, you don't eat any part of the brain or the brain stem, and you don't nick the spinal cord, they say that it's safe for you to eat deer from a CWD positive deer. Now, for me, as you know, a mom, if I harvested a deer and it looked sick, I probably wouldn't eat it, even if it came back negative for CWD, right? So you just have to use your best judgment there. I always say never, right? So as of right now, the CDC says, it's safe to consume venison. And I know a lot of hunters that go ahead and they test for CWD and they just leave the meat in the freezer and they wait till they get those results back, which now a lot more effective process of testing and it's a lot faster results, where when we were first discovering CWD in our state, the testing times were like a month or longer. And so it was a little bit crazy, especially during, heavy times when people like opening weekend and things like that. And so I say just use your best judgment. If you harvest a deer and they obviously don't look good, then I probably would not consume that meat. As a hunter, I would encourage all hunters to allow their deer to be tested for CWD. If you take them to a check station, you can get that test done for free. Like the biologists are there to take those samples. Be aware, if you are a hunter, be aware of where those mandatory surveillance zones are, because we've done a lot more over the last 2 years. So be sure that that's something else that I can send out to the AgriLife agents. If you just, Google CWD, TPWD, it'll show you where the surveillance zones are, because in the surveillance zones, it's mandatory. If you harvest a deer in those surveillance zones, you have to take it to a check station to get it tested. So, and usually the test results are coming back within 2 weeks, if not sooner than that, from what my experience from the testing that we were doing here in San Antonio. So,
Okay,
All right, I'm sorry, Gary, go ahead.
I just said thank you.
Oh, okay.
thank you.
With regards to time, we've got one more question,
Sure.
and then we'll move on to Brittany's presentation.
Yeah.
With regards to development, is the area surveyed for deer and other wildlife to determine the impact on the deer in the existing area?
So in urban areas, we aren't doing, as far as official capacity with Texas Parks and Wildlife, we aren't doing any type of official surveys on deer or any other type of wildlife species. Now we do have like citizen science projects such as iNaturalist projects for mammals or herps of Texas, those types of things that people are monitoring. Because of course, so I am one of two biologists, urban biologists that are focused in San Antonio, and like Sam and Rachel are the ones up in DFW, and we've got so much work, like we don't even have time to get to everything. And so much like our regulatory biologists, there's only so much one person can do, right? And so as far as actual official surveys in urban environments, we're not doing that. There are like camera studies that are being done, and then of course studies through universities that are being done, but it's very selective for different things, the different questions that need to be answered, right? So we maybe have some data out there of what we're seeing through citizen science and university projects and the camera surveys that people are doing in some of the communities, but it's not a full-on extensive research. So like the regulatory biologists, they do their spotlight surveys every year. And we also do dove surveys every year. And that's all tied back to harvest recommendations for upcoming years. So those things are done regularly. We do urban dove surveys, which kind of look at doves in the urban environment. But other than that, that's about the capacity that we do there.
Awesome. Thank you. So everyone, if you still have some questions, I will be sending out the link to the recording next week. And I'll also make sure that I send out Jessica and Rachel's contact information. If you've got further questions on any of this, y'all more than welcome to contact them directly with it. So now, before we go on to Brittany, Rachel, was there anything that you wanted to add to things that were said about the DFW area?
I can just real quickly here, since I know that we're kind of focused on the DFW area a little bit. So deer are not as abundant in North Texas as they are in Central Texas. That's just how it is. They don't like it as much up here, but we do have some areas in North Texas where deer populations are quite abundant. So what I have up here on the screen right now is iNaturalist. This is a citizen science website. If you're not familiar with it, basically the way it works is people record observations of animals that they see, or plants, animals, any living thing, and they put it up here with a location on this website. So it's really great for getting information about where different species are located in an area. And so the map that you're looking at now is white-tailed deer in the DFW area. And so every little blue dot represents an observation of a white-tailed deer. So it kind of gives you an idea, deer in DFW, they're really kind of in pockets, mostly around our lakes and mostly kind of on the fringes of the Metroplex. So we don't really have deer roaming around like downtown Fort Worth or downtown Dallas. So that being said, there are some places where there is potential for conflict between people and deer, where they are quite abundant. And I'd also just like to point out that iNaturalist is not necessarily a representation of everywhere that deer are. For example, there are a lot of deer around Lake Lavon. There just aren't people using iNaturalist recording them out there. But for the purposes of kind of looking at where urban deer might be a problem, it makes sense to use iNaturalist, because where you have people documenting the deer is where you're most likely to have people that are kind of encountering them. So anyway, just to kind of give you an idea of the landscape and what it looks like, someone had mentioned like Weatherford earlier and the development that's occurring around there. So this is just kind of a view of Lake Weatherford to kind of give you an idea. There are certainly abundant deer in this area. I know there's more than what the map is kind of showing. And although there is new development happening, there is still plenty of green space, although wildlife should be able to find kind of transportation corridors to move out of that area if they do need to. Compare that to Central Texas. I've pulled up Austin here, and you can see there are quite a few more deer in Austin that are not just on the outskirts of the city, but are kind of in really the more developed parts of the city as well. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of share that with y'all since I know a lot of y'all are from the DFW area on this, and that's all I really had, and I'll let Brittany get to her presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. So now we will move on to Miss Brittany Meyer, who is going to be covering our landscape options for us today.
Okay, can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Looks good, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so we are going to talk about deer resistant plants that you can put in your front yard or in your landscape to help deter deer from completely annihilating everything you've planted. So with deer resistant plants, texture is key. You know, a lot of our natives plants are great options because they already have defenses that they've evolved for to not be eaten, not to be consumed by animals. These plants generally are going to have some kind of thorns or spines, tough flesh. Milkweed is a beautiful plant that is highly toxic to pretty much everything else except for our monarch butterflies. And a lot of our native plants tend to be kind of sparse in those really nice leafy green foliage. Small tree protection, Jessica mentioned putting cages around either small trees or newly planted trees. Try to not have them like super close to the bark, especially on smaller trees, so you're not going to girdle that tree. But having some kind of cage to keep those deer from wanting to, you know, rub their velvet off or mark their territory. And then also on your trees to help deter them is to prune those lower branches so they can't reach up on their hind legs and actually get to the leaves on the bottom. And then, as Jessica said, just because it's deer resistant doesn't mean a deer is not going to try to eat it. If we're in desperate times for those deer, all they care about is survival and reproduction, and that is their main goals. So just because, you know, we have a cactus with a ton of spines doesn't mean the deer is not going to try to eat it. So just remember, there is no actual deer proof landscaping. Deer are going to eat when they need to eat. And of course, it's also about trial and error. I mean, how many times have you walked out and seen a few deer nomming on your landscape and you tell them, or you shout out them and they just kind of give you a look of like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? So, and again, plants that are considered deer resistant in one area may not be in a different area. So a lot of these plants that are labeled deer resistant are usually officially or most likely unofficially gone through some kind of trial in someone's yard or a landscape area. So you just have to see what's going to work for your area and your, depending on how heavy your deer population is, you might need to be a little more aggressive with what you do plant. And when I say aggressive, I mean those plants that are really, really deer resistant compared to the typical landscape plants that we all want to have in our yards. And like I said, during a dry year, during the drought like we just have, deer are going to sink their teeth into anything that is green, anything that's going to give them some kind of food source. And due to, you know, loss of habitat and a lot of no management plans, keeping deer out of the landscape has become a huge challenge. My parents, we luckily have 5 acres, but we also have development around us. So we've seen a lot of people dealing with, 20 to 30 deer in their front yard just hanging out. So because of that development around us, we're dealing with a lot more deer in my parents' yard and dealing with the vegetation loss. And again, no plant is truly safe, no matter what. Because deer, fun fact, they can't read. It's just like with deer crossing, that doesn't mean a deer is going to cross there. And just because it's labeled deer resistant doesn't mean the deer realize that. So again, as Jessica said, there's 4.6 million white-tailed deer within Texas. We are battling a huge population, and this, when taking away their natural habitat, so it's going to be a give and take with our deer. We need to learn to live with them, not fight against them. So how a lot of plants are divided into resistant categories. We have our rarely damaged plants. Those are the ones that, unless there is no other food around, there's extreme circumstances, deer are going to avoid these plants at all costs. So we have our milkweeds. Again, those are toxic. Our big blue stem, the leaves on those tend to be kind of sharp. Cactus with spines, any yucca, and then lily of the valley. Excuse me. And then those that are in the seldom damaged category, deer are generally going to avoid them. And it's going to be more of a, okay, I guess I'll eat this because it's here. We have maiden, hair fern, lemon mint, snow on the mountain, Texas mountain laurel, aster and white mistflower. And then those that are occasionally damaged, it's just because deer aren't really going to find them really palatable. They're not going to want to eat them at first. They're not the nice leafy, really succulent greens that they want to eat. They're more tend to be on the drier side, or the leaf texture is just not what they want to have in their mouth. So where can you find really good sources and lists for these deer resistant plants? Of course, Aggie Horticulture. So Deer in the Urban Landscape series, there's a few of these. A good one by John A. Life, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is really good. And there's also another really good one for around the hill country area that is deer resistant landscape plants. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website has a amazing deer resistant species list that has about 341 plants on it. And then of course, other extension services and universities, because I mean, Texas isn't the only one that deals with deer. So New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Louisiana are also going to have good lists for a lot of our other areas. And even Mexico has some really great lists for those down in South Texas. So a good thing about the Lady Bird Johnson website, as you see under benefit, it's going to have like, okay, ornamental use, food use, but a lot of them are going to have their deer resistant category. So if there's a plant that you really want to put in your yard, you can look this plant up, and under the benefit section, you got to scroll down a little bit. You're going to find that deer resistant option. And excuse me. And see if it's high, moderate, low, or just not resistant at all. So now we're going to get into some actual plants that you can plant in your yard. A lot of these are natives or plants that most people don't really think about using in the landscape because they're not traditional landscape plants. So some of our trees, we have the beautiful big tooth maple. It gets about 10 to 15 feet tall. Its bark is dark brown with kind of scaly looking with nice erect branches. It has these beautiful big leaves, and that's why people love them. I mean, the scientific name literally means large tooth, talking about those leaves. It has a nice spreading dense crown, and you can often, if you really want to, you can make it a shrub, but it's best as a nice, beautiful big tree. We have the Texas sugarberry, which this is a big tree. This can get 60 to 80 feet in height, and a lot of times just as wide. So if you are looking for a nice big tree, this is a great option for you. And then we have a beautiful, what's called a Texas smoke tree that a lot of people haven't heard of or really seen. It's a smaller ornamental tree. Its leaves are blue-green in the spring and summer, and then during the fall, they have oranges and red, beautiful colors. And then how it gets its name is the flowers of the smoke tree look like small clouds or puffs of smoke. And those can be anywhere from a pink color to a pretty purple color during the spring. And it's a really visually interesting tree that a lot of people don't use. And this is also a tree that is great for drought tolerance. You don't want to overwater it, over fertilize it. So once it's established, you can just kind of let it be. So again, this is a beautiful tree that a lot of people don't use, and also one that doesn't require a lot of maintenance. And then we have our Texas pistachio tree. It's a large, airy, it could be a shrub or a multi-trunk small tree. Best for deer resistance is to use it as that multi-trunk tree that could be 12 to 20 feet tall. It has really pretty glossy foliage, and it gets reddish in the spring, turning it into a dark green color. And then it has clusters of small white flowers that are then followed by small clusters of red fruit. So these are some great options. Obviously, there are tons more, but these are some that are not used in our landscape as much, and they're great options. So some shrubs that you can use, the Damianita, is a great native that is highly resistant to deer. And though it is an evergreen shrub, but it's also used for these beautiful yellow flowers, and it is extremely drought tolerant. So we just had a horrible drought, so a lot of people are looking for more drought tolerant landscape plants. As you can see, this one is literally planted in gravel and rocks. So clearly it's going to be beautiful and drought resistant as well. So then we have our sages. We have the mealy blue sage and the scarlet sage. These are great natives that are highly resistant, but they're great for our pollinators. I've worked at a public garden, and during spring, summer, and even fall, these shrubs are covered in our not only honeybees, but our native bees, our native pollinators. And it's just great to go out and be able to see, big bumblebees and carpenter bees just having a great time and enjoying these beautiful plants that have obviously these stunning flowers that they produce. Another less known plant for a shrub is this coral berry. So it can be small and mounded, or you can let it get up to about 6 feet tall, but it's going to produce these really pretty pink to purple colored berries that stay on during the winter. So not only are they visually stunning, they're going to be great for our bird populations to help them have food during the winter. And these are really robust plants. So if it gets too big, too leggy, it's just kind of taken over, you can straight cut it to the ground, or during the winter, if you don't want just the branches, cut it to the ground, and it's going to come back more bushy and beautiful next year. Some flowers and ground covers. So we have our native purple prairie verbena. Obviously, it is used for these beautiful pink and light purple flowers. It's highly resistant to deer. You can get not only these purple flowers, but you can get pink, lavender, It varies in a lot of different colors, just because one year it has purple flowers and the next year it might produce some different colors. And again, another highly drought tolerant plant. This woolly ironweed is also really interesting to see in the landscape, highly resistant to deer. It gets about 10 to 30 inches in height, and it has these really pretty gray stems that eventually form into the flowers. But these stems, I've used them in bridal bouquets that I've made before, and they're just very interesting. People are going to ask you about them, and hopefully, you can educate your neighbors on our native plants more and help with the deer issue in your neighborhoods if more people have these deer resistant plants. So as you see in the species name is Lindheimer. Fun fact, if you don't know who Ferdinand Jacob Lindheimer is, he is often called the father of Texas botany because he was the first permanent resident plant collector in Texas. So that's a fun little fact that I really like to tell people, because there's a lot of species like Lindheimer muley that we talk about that are named after him. And then another really great landscape plant, if you have areas in your landscape that get a little more moisture, or you have some kind of pond or something, is this southern maidenhair fern. It has very specific, growing requirements. It needs to be have a good amount of water and drainage, but if it doesn't have water, it'll go dormant. You just need to kind of sustain it through those drought months with supplemental water, but it will come back. And a lot of people use it as a great ground cover or in crevices of rocks or cobblestones. And it doesn't produce really any flowers, but it produces these really interesting leaves that are just visually interesting to look at. And of course, we have our cactus and succulents. This cane cactus is great for our native bees, though it's not a native to Texas. It is grown in Arizona and Mexico. You can find it in the Rio Grande, along the Rio Grande growing. And it has these stunning flowers, but you can see why deer wouldn't want to eat this. You see all these little spines along it. I mean, I wouldn't want to eat something that's going to attack me back. That's just not fair. So deer are generally not going to eat it unless it's super desperate times. But it's really pretty. It's something that's not normally found in our landscapes, but something that I believe should be used more often. Then we have this yucca that is Spanish dagger. It can be a shrub or a small tree if you allow it to get over 10 feet tall. It has these leaves or spikes that have sharp points at the end that get up to about 3 feet long, in wide clumps at the end of stems. And when they die, it's kind of like our palm trees. As the tree gets taller and these leaves die off, they just hang out at the bottom. You can either remove them or leave them be. And then they produce these beautiful clusters of flowers during March and April. And then of course we have our Texas plant, state plant of Texas is our prickly pear. It often grows up to 5 feet tall, but you'll see most of them in a spreading aspect. And the pads can be either this green color or a blue-green color. And they get to about 4 to 10 inches long. And then they have these spines that come off of it. Again, we do have a spineless prickly pear, but if you want it to be deer resistant, you're going to want it to be the spine one. And it has 1 to 6 spines per cluster. And interesting, if you can kind of see from this picture, there is always one spine that is longer than the others. That's just one of its characteristics of this cactus, which I thought was really interesting. Not only does it have these yellow spines on it, but it produces beautiful yellow to red flowers, and it can also have multiple colored flowers on the same plant. And then, of course, it has these fruit that you can eat. They're really delicious. You can pick them and prepare them how you wish. And then our native grasses. So we have our eastern gamma grass that gets about 2 to 3 feet in height. And it looks great in the landscape if you want to have some clumps of it and as some different textures in your landscape. And then though deer do like to eat the seeds that come off of it, that's all they want, because the leaf blades are really sharp. So the deer aren't going to eat them if they don't have to, because it's going to tear up their mouths, possibly cause abscesses. So they're not going to eat it. And then we have the native big blue stem, which again is highly resistant. And this is a bunch grass that stems can be 4 to 8 feet tall. You can mow it and keep it at a manageable level. This is also part of what we call the big 4 of our native grass species within the prairies of North America. The other 3 are Indian grass, switchgrass, and our native little blue stem. So obviously big blue stem tends to be taller than the other 3, but this is a great alternative or a great addition to your landscape to give it a visual, stunningly visual aspect. And then one of my favorite grasses is buffalo grass right down here, because this can be used as a lawn alternative. It is a soft gray-green or blue-green perennial grass that grows from 3 to 12 inches, and it spreads by rhizomes. It's long-lived. If you can see in this picture, the leaf blades are really slender and kind of curly with small, compact seed heads. It is very, very, very drought tolerant. It is a great grass to use for lawn areas, and it's become pretty popular, but a lot of people don't know about it. It does best in clay loam soils, and it can survive on as little as 1 to ½ inch of water per month. So again, trying to save water, conserve water. We just went through a horrible drought where we saw our Bermuda and St. Augustine just die back when it wasn't watered. But this buffalo grass can survive with almost no water per month. There are different cultivars of it. For those that you want to use it for turf grass, we have Prairie, 609, and Stampede. That Stampede does not get any taller than 4 inches. So using that cultivar, you don't even have to mow your grass anymore if you are fine with it being at 4 inches, which is a great height for turf grass.
Hey, Brittany, can I interrupt you for just a second? There's a question in the chat box.
Yeah.
Is the cane cactus considered invasive, and is it easily spread?
So it is not a Texas invasive. It easily spreads like most cactus do. They're easily propagated, but it's also easily managed. So it's not going to overtake an area or anything. So you can let it spread if you want, or you can keep it nice and compacted.
Thank you.
So where can you find good seed sources? So one of my favorites is Native American Seed, that even has a deer resistant mix that you can buy that is pretty good priced. And also you can look up native landscape nurseries in your area that are either going to have seed, or they're going to have the native plants that we spoke about, or other ones that you can find. So there are tons of sources around. I know within Tarrant County, our regional water district, Tarrant Regional Water District, has a list on their website of nurseries that sell our native plants. And I believe other water districts throughout Texas have something similar, or they're going to know where to find those native plants. And just a little message to leave with, kind of some things that Jessica said. I mean, don't hate the deer. They're beneficial to our ecosystem when they're managed properly. You know, Texas, everyone wants to move here. Everyone wants to live here. So we're having more and more urban and developed areas, taking away those natural habitat of our native white-tailed deer. And as I said before, there is no such thing as a deer-proof plant. There's deer resistant, but there's nothing deer-proof. If deer want to eat it, they're going to eat it. I mean, I've seen deer try to eat plastic plants. So if it looks like a plant, it looks like something they can eat, they're going to try to eat it if they really need to. And then deer are crucial to our ecosystem. You know, they provide food for larger predators when they are in their natural habitat. And then at correct populations, they are great for biodiversity, even in urban and developed areas, and encourage new plant growth. So with that, I kind of went through a little quickly because I know we were short on time, but if you have any questions, you can, here's my office number, my email, and then our Tarrant County website.
Brittany, this was not a question, but it was stated in the chat box, and it's actually some good information. If you choose to grow the Texas Mountain or the Texas Laurel, please make sure your neighbors do not have bees. The honey becomes toxic if the bees harvest pollen from those trees.
Yeah, so that is one of the reasons why the Texas Mountain Laurel is a great deer-resistant plant, because it does have toxic properties to it, especially the seeds. So, I mean, we do have to be conscious of our honeybees, but it is good for our native bees.
Well, thank you, Brittany. We will open it up for questions at this time. I have also placed a program survey link in the chat box. If you would please take a few minutes, it's a short survey. If you would click on that and fill that out, that helps us here at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension to make sure that we are continuously bringing you information that is relevant to what y'all are needing, and as well it helps us as far as reporting back to the state, not only just from wildlife but from all program areas.
And I do have the direct link to the website for, if it'll paste, okay, let me get it, for where I found the deer resistant list from the Wildflower Center. So I can copy and paste that real quick.
And Brittany, if you will email that to me as well, I will put that in an email with the link to this program next week, once I get it posted to our YouTube page and it's edited a little bit.
Yeah, and I have either the link or PDFs to those articles I talked about.
Perfect. Well, if there are no questions, yes,
Oh.
You've got hand raised.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I could be wrong on this, but on the scientific name for buffalo grass, it looked like it was supposed to be dactyloides instead of little lua. Is that correct or not? You can look at your slides and see if that
Yeah.
was
So it is Dactylodes.
yeah, it's supposed, I know it's dactyloides, but it's supposed to be bucculodactyloides instead of little lua.
I mean, this is what I've seen and what I've used. So
That's all
I will
right.
say scientific names change a lot during my master's degree. Some of the stuff that I worked on, their scientific names changed 3 times in 2 years. So
That's all right. It's kind of a technical thing. I thought it was Bidalua gracilis, and Buccolodactyloides with scientific names on grasses. I just happen to remember that from my grass course.
Yeah, they change all the time and they change without warning. Like there's no announcement made. So,
Okay, thank you.
and that was pulled directly from the Lady Bird Johnson wildflower website.
I see. Okay.
All righty. Thank you, Brittany, Jessica, and Rachel. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, wait, here's a question. Is the sugarberry the same as the hackberry?
Yes, so, sugarberry is another name for hackberry. So if you look it up by the scientific name, it's going to bring up it has like 5 or 6 different common names. So that's why I also had the scientific names along with the common names.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Again, I will repost the link for the survey in the chat box. If y'all would take a few minutes to fill that out for us, we would greatly appreciate it. That information is needed for us as far as for end of year reporting back to the state as well as to AgriLife on things. Again, I'd like to thank all the presenters that were here with us today, as well as everybody that has joined us. We are ending a few minutes before 2 o'clock, which is perfectly fine. And we will wish everyone a happy Friday and have a wonderful weekend.